Mic check. Good morning. Should I do it? Very good. Very good. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Excited to be here. Looking forward to what we're going to do today.
On. Ready for launch? Ready.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming today to the TP presentations for this year's Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program. We're excited to see everybody in the room today. We're excited to be able to stream this out live as well so that folks around can view us as well. For anyone who does not know me yet, my name is James Lewis, and I'm the director this year of the program, and I serve alongside of Gaktu Karaja Aliolu. I appreciate his help to know the program and getting to know how there's such wonderful activities in this program. I've seen folks busy the last couple of weeks working on the TP projects, and so excited to see the presentation and see how the product turned out. I do have, again, that one request that folks turn off their cell phones or silence them so we don't interrupt the presenters. However, first I would like to add, in gathering here today, we acknowledge the Garner people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend the respect to other Aboriginal people present. The second acknowledgement I'd like to make is to our TP sponsor this year, who is the 10 to the 9th Foundation. So before we get started today in terms of turning this over floor to the first TP, just a little background. So from a program perspective, we worked for several months trying to figure out what was the best topics for TPs this year. And so we try to find things that are timely and very topical and very important, we think, relevant to society today. So we'll have two presentations. The first one up this morning we call officially officially titled Creating a Space Innovation Ecosystem. While I don't want to steal their solar wind, it is about studying and making recommendations to emerging nations, space nations, on how to develop their national space ecosystems. And I think it's a little bit of a challenge to everybody else in the ecosystem who is more mature to help out and help along those that are coming behind. A little later this morning, We have the TP Artemis, which is focused on a very highly visible Artemis moon program, and will explore how many nations will work together and live together on the moon. The TP Artemis has a new name, but I'll let them introduce that themselves. From a ground rules perspective, each TP will have 50 minutes to deliver their final presentation, which is, again, this is part of their grading for this activity. There will be followed by a 30-minute period for questions and answers. And there are assessors here today in the room and several online who will be judging the presentation and the results. But we do appreciate for any questions that you do hold it to the question and answer period. So, without further ado, I would like to ask the TP Ecosystems presenters team to come up and feel free to take over.
Good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us here today at the University of South Australia's Mawson Lakes campus. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to any ISU faculty, esteemed guests, and friends and family who may be watching us online. So, you want to build a space ecosystem. We hope that our presentation today will inspire you to and give you the ability to do that wherever you may be. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ariane.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ariane, and I come from Whadjuk Noongar country in Western Australia. But today, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of Adelaide Plains. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional country you're standing on, wherever in the world you may be watching us today. We as a team want to thank the Kaurna people for looking after the country that for the past 5 weeks we have lived, worked and played on. We as a team stand in solidarity with their elders past and present, who for more than 70,000 years have protected the lands we walk on, looking after its waterways, and importantly, watching the skies. Since the beginning of time, our ancestors across every culture have been looking up at the stars and dreaming. The stars connect us. They create stories that form cultures, and they caused us to explore. And now today, a culmination of all those years of dreaming, we are standing on the precipice of a new space age. In our lifetimes, we will see the next human on the moon. For many of us, we will see the first human on Mars. And some of us, within this very room, will even get the chance to travel to space and see our beautiful blue planet from a totally new vantage. The global space sector is undergoing major changes as it seeks to solve humanity's wider planetary problems using space technology and applications. We are shifting from a government-driven space economy to what is now described as the new space industry. This is characterised by cheaper and more accessible services and applications, private equity, new markets, entrepreneurs, and sustainable development goals. But with this evolution comes unique challenges when ensuring that space truly does remain for all humankind. Currently, within the global space sector, different nations have different capabilities and infrastructure, which affects their ability to be able to create and sustain a space innovation ecosystem. We are already seeing aspiring space nations lagging behind emerging space nations, who are then further eclipsed by the strong space heritage of developed space nations. How is it then that we can help the global space sector ensure that we don't further embed existing disparities between space ecosystems? How can we ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and leave others behind. We as a team believe there is a strong need to provide a framework for industry or government stakeholders to create and develop a sustainable and prosperous space innovation ecosystem through public and private initiatives on a national or global scale. As part of this framework, which we have developed and that we'll be sharing with you this morning, we examine space ecosystems at different levels of maturity and identify the factors that contribute to their success. We did this by collecting, analysing and collating research into 3 case studies. We also explore public and private-driven initiatives and their impact on space ecosystems, as well as showcasing success stories and highlighting future opportunities that exist. And then finally, we propose recommendations that can be practically implemented to catalyse a space innovation ecosystem at any level of maturity, while also acknowledging the ethical limitations and considerations that come into play here too. I'd now like to welcome my colleague Josh, who is going to speak more to our case studies.
So what is it that we're trying to build exactly? Well, we understand from a period of engagement with multiple industry leaders through the sector that a space innovation ecosystem is a complex network, an architecture of actors and connections, and it's the interaction between these stakeholders that drive activity. An ecosystem has a shared vision or a common goal for the future, and it acts as a magnet, drawing in organisations to present opportunities for collaboration and cooperation. The level of sophistication that an ecosystem achieves is dependent on its ability to integrate across several disciplines, built on a mutually supportive foundation. Our team decided that to set the conditions for our report, we would use an existing successful model framework to be able to guide our research and enable us to inform our recommendations. The Luxembourg Space Agency designed such a framework, and they were able to use this to establish their own space ecosystem. They created an environment which was unique for businesses to be able to generate new space activities. Their strategy is well established, so we use this example as a reference to conduct our case studies. Their framework is based on 5 pillars: political support, research and education, innovation, R&D, funding, and legal framework. Political support is essential for any ecosystem. Governments set direction and they prioritise programs. Governments can also set policy initiatives which drive further business growth. Research and education is vital for the growth of the space industry, and it enables the development of the workforce of the future. International Space University also provides opportunities as a pathway for new entrants who are looking to be involved in the space sector, and represents an additional way for people to collaborate internationally. Innovation R&D is focusing on driving new technologies, and particularly when this is coupled between commercial entities and research institutes. Innovation hubs also serve as an opportunity to be able to further stimulate growth of the ecosystem by presenting an opportunity for the sharing of ideas and trust being formed between actors. Funding generally comes from 2 sources, private and public. It should be noted that public funding is generally the government expenditure in 2 places, being civil and defence spending. And the open source information which we've been able to derive for our report is reflected accordingly, and the private funding is generally injected into companies which are commercially viable. So this further grows the ecosystem. And lastly, legal framework is essentially the licence to conduct space activities in a safe and sustainable manner. It's based on international law which is agreed upon at the United Nations. In this report, you'll notice that we have utilised a maturity index. This maturity index enabled us to define how we were going to approach the rest of the report and conduct case studies on a various number of levels of development. The levels that we chose to inform this were developed, emerging, and aspiring. A developed ecosystem is generally categorised by a well-established, mature organisation, a network that is well established in creating new businesses and new technologies, and will have human activity in space. An emerging ecosystem will consist of a growing network, and it will have an increased demand for space products and services, as well as an increase in investment. An aspiring network is, an aspiring ecosystem is an evolving network, and it is categorised by stakeholders attempting to find their place in the market, finding a niche and a path to growth. Please turn your attention now to the screens to see a video which summarises our case study findings with respect to the 5 pillars and the maturity index. Please note that for those watching online, that the quality may differ depending on your connection.
The first part of our team project was to develop and conduct case studies to inform our recommendations. This process included researching 3 countries which we considered to be at different developmental stages. For a developed ecosystem example, we chose the United States of America. For an emerging ecosystem example, we chose Australia. And finally, we chose Kenya to be our example of an aspiring space ecosystem. Each of these countries was studied using 5 key pillars: political, innovation, research and development, funding, legal framework, and educational outreach.
The United States is the benchmark for a developed space innovation ecosystem and has been a leading world power in space since the establishment of National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1958. The US has the highest government expenditure with $62 billion, that is 5 times more than China, 18 times more than Russia, and 190 times more than Australia. The significant commercial activity is improving this ecosystem further, with over half of the world's space technology companies operating from the US as of 2021. The massive workforce requirement is supported by a focused education effort with 850 tertiary education programs affiliated with space and associated grant programs. The US sets a sound example for a developed ecosystem's legal framework which supports further growth. The 8 acts of space legislation have been implemented with provisions for encouraging industries while dictating the responsible measures to ensure sustainability. The US does use its strong international influence to align other emerging ecosystems in its legislative agenda through the Artemis Accords. The development of space technology and the innovations were driven by the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War, particularly through Project Apollo. As a result, advancements were made in the field of space exploration and technology, which paved the way for private company growth stimulated through prize competition initiatives like Ansari and Google X Prize. The innovation space ecosystem in the US has given birth to measures which reduced cost and increased efficiency, leading to economic growth and technological advancements in various other industries.
While recognising that the US is one of the more developed nations in regards to a space innovation ecosystem, Australia is considered an emerging ecosystem, still developing its space capabilities. The Australian government's expenditure in space was estimated at $473 million in 2022, representing a 46% increase from 2021. This demonstrates the government's clear interest in growing the space sector. The Australian Space Agency, commenced in 2018, is set to deliver on the vision of tripling the size of Australia's space industry to an equivalent $8 billion and growing the workforce by creating an additional 20,000 jobs by 2030. The Australian Government is committed to building the education pipeline towards a space-related workforce, with 54 education and research institutions currently offering curriculum relevant to the space industry supply chain, enabling the upskilling for the jobs of the future. Australia has transformed its focus on space initiatives, as demonstrated through renewed legislation to regulate the conduct of space launch and return activities. Through this, Australia became the 6th nation in the world to introduce a targeted legislative framework for space activities. Australia also has a progressive approach to international law and is one of only 17 nations to have ratified all 5 United Nations space treaties. As an emerging nation, Australia has developed an informed legislative framework to lay the foundation for some of the most industry-friendly space regulations in the world. Several innovation hubs have been strategically established throughout Australia to support the growth of startups and SMEs through targeted national and international collaboration with research institutes and industry. The government support has encouraged the growth of commercial participation, with 388 companies currently contributing to developing Australia's innovation ecosystem.
Despite having only limited space activity in Kenya presently, the nation aspires to develop a thriving space ecosystem. Very favorable conditions exist for an emerging industry, particularly in regards to geography. Kenya's involvement in space activities started in 1962 with the Italian satellite launching and tracking station in Malindi, which saw the launch of 29 rockets through 1989. However, it was not until 2017 that the Kenya Space Agency was established. Though they are yet to release legislation, the agency is currently working on revising policy and regulation in collaboration with United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. Research indicates that the Kenyan government spent less than $10 million on space activities in 2021 and 2022. This represents Kenya as a lower-tier contributor in the global market. The Kenyan government launched Kenya Vision 2030 to encourage the growth of the rapidly developing economy. Currently, there are minimal options for space-focused education within the country. According to the 2019 survey, only 24.5% of the population achieve secondary level education and only 3.5% of progress to achieve a tertiary education. Fortunately, academia has been involved in space through university contributions in designing and manufacturing of 1U CubeSat. In addition, Kenya is currently working on a 3U software-defined CubeSat dubbed Taifa-1, and also intends to conduct scientific research efforts with the Chinese space station through Baredi Sana project.
From the case studies we have conducted, a few key points stand out between each ecosystem. Initially, we see that the USA provides significantly more government funding than both Australia and Kenya, and its government agency, NASA, has had more time to develop. Even though Kenya created its space agency before Australia, we consider Australia to be more developed. There are several reasons for this, which include more legislation, more financial support, and more academic institutions. With respect to this information, our team has developed 8 recommendations which span both public and private sectors.
The 5 pillars mentioned here consist of public and private sector. In the public sector, we focus on the role of government in building and sustaining space ecosystems. And in the private sector, we focus on the role of private companies in building ventures that contribute towards space economies in these ecosystems. By definition, an ecosystem is a network of connections. And governments are full of powerful and influential connectors. When John F. Kennedy came up and declared that the US would land on the moon, that rallied not just Americans, but human beings all over the world. And that historical moment was televised globally, inspiring millions to join the space race at that point. The motivation of any such mission for a country is for the prosperity of the nation as well as its people. And by design, space applications do just that. They improve the life of humans here on Earth. Earth observation, security, navigation are just a few examples, and the list continues to grow. And as this list grows, we have to acknowledge something important, that the power gap is also growing. So collaboration is absolutely critical. And we're seeing collaboration in many ways because governments are doing a great job already. We're seeing it at a national level through space agencies such as the Australian Space Agency, the Kenya Space Agency, at a regional level through the likes of the European Space Agency, and even further beyond regions through the UN Corpus, for example, which is an extremely important example of global collaboration as it formed the foundation of what is current space law. But collaboration goes beyond just governments. We're seeing it in academia, and it hasn't gladly been limited to just university-level PhDs or graduates. This canned tin of mackerel is certified space food by JAXA. It was designed and developed by teenage students in high school in Japan. My colleague Ariane rightly mentioned earlier that the public sector is shifting and its role in the space ecosystem because of new space. And we're seeing this because traditionally, the International Space Station, for example, was governed by international space agencies such as NASA and the China Space Agency as well. But now we're seeing companies such as Axiom and Orbital Reef by Blue Origin. And these private companies are partnering with the government through private-public partnerships to form for us the next frontier of space-based research. Because of these examples I've given you, we understand the critical role that the government plays. And we see their role in 4 recommendations: to build, promote, protect, and purchase. To build through identifying the strengths, gaps, and establishing partnerships and roadmaps that help to bridge those gaps so that those countries are contributing to the space economy globally. The next is to promote, increasing awareness of the role space plays in everyday life to the public, as well as increasing visibility across the globe of a country's space activities. The third is to protect, ensuring that there's no liability to a country or any of its ecosystem players by adhering to international space law, and more importantly, protecting any contribution towards a space economy through intellectual property frameworks. And the final one is to purchase. Any ecosystem must be sustained with funding, and a government can be a customer to space products and also develop conducive environment for investors and other funders to come in and continue to fund those ecosystems. This has been an eye-opener for us, and it continues to emphasize how critical the public sector is to developing a space ecosystem and also sustaining it. And it has challenged me personally, going back to my country, Kenya, to work closer with the government as an entrepreneur. Speaking of the private sector, I'll now welcome my colleague, Vidika, to speak through private recommendations.
We truly believe that one great idea can start or spark a space ecosystem. We've heard from my colleague, Nambura, on the important role of government in enabling space ecosystems to thrive. And we realize the importance of the private sector in developing and growing ecosystems. In the last decade or so, private companies growth within the space sector has grown dramatically. In May 2020, we saw SpaceX, the first private company, launch a human into space. Launching not only and showcasing technological achievement, but showing that space can be accessed more widely. Also showing and showcasing the spectrum of technologies that are available to a wider population to become involved in space, whilst remaining profitable. This has been the basis of our recommendations, and they span across 4 main themes for the private sector in aspiring nations. These are commercialize, develop, utilize, and partner. It is every entrepreneur's goal to commercialize and see their idea to fruition, creating a successful enterprise. We recommend that private industry should engage early in the market to address future funding challenges, to test their use cases, and to take advantage of tools and mechanisms like accelerators and incubators that provide mentorship, coaching, support, and funding. We have great examples of both of these right here in South Australia. One is Lot 14, which is a precinct to host space activities within the state, including the Australian Space Agency. Another, based right here at UniSA, is the Innovation and Collaboration Centre, which provides most of the services I spoke about in terms of workspace, mentorship, and funding. Our next recommendation turns to develop. Private industry should develop downstream innovation that employs satellite technology or data. Very simply put, upstream technology deals with that investment-heavy infrastructure to do operations in space, like rockets, ground stations, and satellites, whereas downstream technology looks at what applications can be derived from this infrastructure that can benefit society right here on Earth. We recommend for aspiring nations to look more towards downstream technologies, get to know what the national needs and priorities are, and manipulate mostly open source, but also privately available data to identify where these needs are and service them. Our next recommendation is to utilize. Utilize your existing resources and your existing knowledge bases. Private industry should source existing technologies within complementary industries to identify space applications, otherwise known as spin-ins. We're very familiar with technologies that have been transferred or translated from space to Earth, for example, memory foam. But we recommend looking at technologies and infrastructure and applications that can be transferred from Earth to space. Who knew that this orange Tang drink would create a resurgence of the market right here on Earth because it was used for an astronaut for rehydration? Teflon cookware technologies used in space. Wow. Velcro, that thing you use to make sure that your clothes fit properly and that 5-year-olds don't have to learn how to tie their shoes immediately, has been flying up in space since the Apollo age, making sure that everything stays in place in zero gravity. Of course, I list some general, more well-known examples. There are others like solar cells, radiation hardening. And we truly recommend that aspiring nations look to their knowledge bases, look to their national challenges, and help to complement these with their existing resources and infrastructure. I finally bring together our last recommendation of partner. You were informed earlier about the importance of partnership, and more so, public-private partnerships. We recommend that private industry should work closely with government as a key partner within space innovation ecosystems. This potentially long-term partnership can serve to deliver a full model, cheaper missions, and possibly more efficient as well, One such example of this is the NASA-SpaceX partnership. Of course, I'm sure you've heard the term of most scientists and astronomers say, follow the water. What would an entrepreneur say? Follow the money. We recommend that we do both. In order for a sustainable, equal space ecosystem, we need a delicate balance of both. Can you see that within this lies a deep responsibility of developed nations and aspiring nations as well, a responsibility to share knowledge, to mentor, and to run ethically sound businesses. Nobody will speak better to ethics than my colleague, Casey. She will help bring this important point together and close our talk today.
With every venture comes a need to address the big questions that underpin our objectives. What purpose do we have in the things that we want to achieve? Just because we can, should we? And who and what will our actions affect? History has shown us that a lack of foresight and a lack of care to consider leads us to devastating situations which we could have avoided, or at the very least, mitigated. So how do we prevent humanity from refraining to repeat tragedies in the past or perpetuating current problems? Global space innovation ecosystems are still in their formative years. That means that we have an opportunity to build a strong framework and ethical foundation right now, which will enhance all ecosystems to come, just as the Outer Space Treaty and other treaties do. As most of us in this room are aware, the benefits of space in tackling so many of the globe's most pressing issues are amazing. One example that I like, which I found about recently, is to do with the mapping of ocean microplastics using remote sensing, which is just an amazing triumph for satellite applications, particularly when microplastics are so harmful to marine life. However, on the flip side, the space industry also causes and exacerbates other issues, and we must seek to understand these just as much as we understand all the benefits, whether it be through academic inquiry, building the literature, or any other means of investigation. But in reality, time is a luxury that we don't necessarily have. The impacts of space ecosystems affect not only our world to come, but our world right now. So it's important that we figure out ways to implement these considerations as soon as possible. There is one very small way that we can start, and that is by initiating personal introspection. There's a saying in anthropology, you can only enter from where you stand. So I would like to invite you all to assess, where do you stand? About a growing space ecosystem. It might be your fears for future generations. It could be your fears for your community, maybe yourself. So we have already some shown on the screen. Minority exploitation. How does growing space ecosystems leave out certain groups? Disparity between nations, environmental issues such as sustainability, pollution, recolonization, inequality, weaponization of space, repeating mistakes, access. A lot of these enter the same kind of area, which is that we don't want to skew the world any more than it's currently skewed. So how can we use the space ecosystem to create equality and equitable areas and behaviors all throughout the globe? Debris seems to be a huge one up there, as well as environment, which connects to each other. Thank you all for participating and contributing your own concerns. And I hope that this is something that we all continue to think about, and that maybe you saw something up there that you didn't think about before, and that it's something that you will start to consider. For our project, we looked at the challenges, limitations, and ethical considerations in regard to our recommendations. We looked at 4 main areas: political, educational, economical, and environmental. So to give you a brief rundown of all of these, I will start with political. Public and private partnerships should be established with the utmost transparency. More and more, we are seeing how the pursuit of the bottom line is preferenced over the needs of the people, which in turn can influence or unethically bias associated contracts or legislation. Also, what do these partnerships look like for nations with embedded systemic corruption or non-democratic political systems? This is something we should also look into. Secondly, we have educational. Some of this political stress can be alleviated with a strong approach to space education. An educated populace is one that can hold all facets of an ecosystem accountable. This then means that the education provided, the content and the curriculum itself should also be transparent and honest. Let's express the pitfalls and the challenges of space ecosystems to the public, not just the highlights and the benefits. This will encourage and increase public trust, which essentially informs public opinion and equips the public with the tools to actually be able to engage. It then becomes important to make sure that education is accessible across the board, even to regional and remote areas where it may be harder to get access to. Thirdly, we have economical. Collaborative partnerships should be mutually beneficial. In particular, relationships between actors of different maturity level. When one actor is limited in capability, it's important that they receive support from a more mature ecosystem without the risk of being taken advantage of or any exploitation occurring. It's also important to consider the idea of how uneven distribution of wealth might be exacerbated and how we can combat that. And lastly, we have environmental. So with the rapid expansion of commercialization that's presented with new space comes a myriad of environmental impacts. To name a few, we have the increase of space orbital debris and orbital traffic. We also have pollutants associated with launches, air acidification, depletion of the ozone, and so on and so forth. Given our current climate crisis, it's important that we should address these as soon as possible, as best as we can. Thankfully, there are some amazing tools that people can use, companies or the public sector, to make assessments. And these are the environmental impact assessment and the life cycle assessment. These are fantastic tools at establishing the effects of your proposed plans from cradle to death or cradle to cradle. How will they affect the environment, and in what conditions should you move forward? The good thing about this is anyone can use these assessments regardless of their maturity level. 33 years ago, Carl Sagan looked upon what was the furthest image taken of Earth at the time. His words rippled throughout the globe for years to come as he referred to the planet as a pale blue dot. Our pale blue dot. And in all our time on this dot, we have had rises and falls in the name of innovation. So let's at least try to make the space innovation ecosystem a mighty rise. Something else that Carl Sagan said was, exploration is in our nature. We began as wanderers, and we are wanderers still. We have lingered long enough on the shores of the cosmic ocean. We are ready at last to set sail for the stars.
Wow. Thank you, Casey, for those thought-provoking final words. We hope that our presentation today has given you the tools that you need to create a truly sustainable space innovation ecosystem. As a team, we would like to thank the generous support of the 10th to 9th Plus Foundation for making this team project possible, as well as the numerous other organizations that have provided sponsorship to help the Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program be possible. We wanted to acknowledge the generous contributions of our team project chair, Emmeline Part-Dahlstrom, and teaching associates Imad Abdul Shakur and Lisa Kusha, as well as all other ISU faculty who have helped us throughout this project. Additionally, we would like to thank space ecosystem professionals from around the world, some of whom are in this room, for their insight, their contributions, and their assistance in creating the recommendations that we have made. We would like to now open the floor to some questions.
Well, firstly, thank you. Excellent presentation. And from me, that's praise, honestly. I'm not usually out on the presentations. My one question to some extent, and it goes to what Casey was saying and what you just said at the end there, is we're left with a feeling that we can do something good with space. But I wanted to ask the question is how do you align those goals of society, perhaps, that long-term things that we all answered the questions, and that's what we want. But we talk about that, yet in reality, the regulation and the ecosystems are about developing industry. So how do you align those goals and keep those goals real? I just wondered if you had any...
I think Darcy would like to answer this question.
Thank you so much for that question. So absolutely, that's one of the things that we looked into quite a lot, as well as obviously without incentivising these organisations to do the good ideas and innovations that we've promoted today, there's no real chance of making a change in the ecosystem. So what we've promoted and given through as a recommendation in our white paper is to develop a pre-qualification program, if you will, or a qualification program, where organisations can independently strive to achieve these various, what we call positive movements towards the better ecosystem. And once they've achieved that, they then get pre-qualified as priority producers or service suppliers for organisations or government bodies. So that's something that we're doing. So by completing these positive movements as an organisation, they can then get priority to be a supplier. That way incentivising them to do the right thing. That's the first step, although we do have a lot of future directions that we've proposed through the white paper to further explore how to unite, as Vedika said, following the water, but also following the profit as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I especially like the strong finish. Also, the visuals were fantastic. I like the framework. It's very impactful. But when I look at the 8 recommendations, between public and private, I wonder, how's it possible to do all of them really well? And how would you, if you were to prioritize them, which ones would you force rank somehow? That's something where, because, let's just assume we have $80 million and we have 8 areas and we give $10 million to each, or $100 million. It doesn't matter what the amount is. The point is, are we going to distribute it equally, or are we going to prioritize areas? And then also in terms of a timeline, how do you prioritize them? Because there needs to be some impetus that probably comes first.
Thank you for your question. So how we are trying to achieve this in our framework is really going back to the nation's priorities, because we are talking about ecosystem within the specific nations or a country, and it really depends on priorities of that country and capabilities of the country. So we strongly believe that we shouldn't be distributing funding not necessarily equally, because then it becomes a crumbs on the table and everyone gets little. But also we shouldn't have a polarized system either, which is a system of today, where money is actually polarized in certain pockets. So what we are proposing is that the nations in various levels of maturity need to look at their capabilities, so developing capability frameworks and priorities, and also government looking where actually, what are the priorities for that particular nation. So incorporating those should actually lead the ecosystem to be sustainable, but also to address the concerns and the demands of the nations.
I believe we're taking questions from the online now. No?
Take online one first.
Take. We'll go to Carrie and then online.
Okay, you've put forth a really interesting approach, emphasising ethics in the framework that you've put forward. So how do you consider addressing things like, we have companies like SpaceX who want to put thousands of satellites into the sky, and we're seeing Indigenous peoples around the world who say that having those satellites crossing the night sky will create such a disruption to their spiritual and cultural connections to sky. How do you balance that in an emerging or a growing space ecosystem?
Yes, thank you for the question. So it is very important in order to have a sustainable ecosystem, which means that it is not preventing future generations to keep the same lifestyle and to expand the technologies that we have today, to keep a world which is clean and to have technologies that are not impactful. And of course, the one you mentioned, it is very impactful. And with the rate that satellites have been launched in the last years, we have an average of 14 satellites launched every week, which is crazy. So, and one good step moving in the direction of solving this or addressing this issue is an agreement that was that came some years ago about the fact that now every satellite can be in space only 25 years. They want to even reduce that. At European level, there is a discussion ongoing right now that has acknowledged satellite as pollution in space. So then this is the first step, acknowledging it, and also understanding that sustainability in space is quite an important aspect, and space debris is connected with the problem of launching a lot of satellites. A similar tool is the sustainability rating. So there are initiatives in place to address this, and we think that a lot of companies are now looking into space debris removal, which is also going to help.
Thank you, Francesca. I think online question next. Not sure who controls that, but Francois maybe.
Thanks a lot, and hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I spent a very nice time with all of you some time ago. Thanks also for the great presentation. Very clear, very going right to the point you wanted to make, and that was really nice to hear and to watch. One specific question is related to one of the elements you have presented, which is the weight of the public sector with respect to the one of the private sector. You have talked about PPPs, you have talked a lot about private investment, private and entrepreneurs, etc. And indeed, this is a significant part of the space ecosystem. However, as you probably know, the public sector is still the elephant in the room. And I wanted you to maybe elaborate a little bit on the trends of the public sector in terms of investment, in terms of innovation, in terms of supporting the academic world versus what is done in the private sector. So in other words, my question is, how do you foresee the evolution of the public investment in space versus the one of the private investment? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the good question. Like as you have mentioned that public sector is a white elephant, but everything cannot be done by a single entity. So there is this tremendous shift in the trend where they are giving various tasks, mostly in the field of R&D and innovation, to the academia, education, and to the private sector. Because this need a very less investment. So when we can see there are certain program of NASA where they have incorporated the R&D component and education institute where they have put certain instruments on board. So there is a shift because like if this public things are getting more towards the R&D, the future missions, and the other things which small education institute can do, they are doing it. So there's a tremendous shift where the private players, especially the companies which are working towards downstream applications like remote sensing and Earth observation, they are making use of these technologies to make the sensors which are in the terms of nanosatellites and other things. And like they are funding, the public, the government are funding these institutes to deliver innovative solutions to come up with the existing problem which they are having. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod. I believe we'll go to the next question from Philomena.
Yes, thank you very much. I agreed with one of our previous speakers who said that the graphics were great, and we were able to see them quite well here, and they really did let us have our own imagination, and you guided us with those graphics. My question has to do with the roadmap or framework that you used with the 5 pillars. When I think of the word ecosystem, for me as a biologist, that's what I think of. But I can see with your framework that it was very policy-oriented. So my question is, it's difficult because you have a project, but what audience was your primary audience in your own mind when you were thinking about this presentation, looking at the case studies? Who did you imagine in front of you?
Thank you, Philomena. So who did we imagine in front of us? The first stakeholders we imagine is really a governments, because we were looking through the lens of aspiring nations. So we wanted to put a framework that actually is very applicable to the aspiring nation. So in the public sector recommendations, our audience is really a government, and we want to see a government investments towards the developing of space capability, but in conjunction with private sectors. So we don't want necessarily what they called all space or all terminology, so that the government funds everything. We need that public-private partnership and synergies there. And then for the private sector, our audience really are companies, and particularly startup companies, because in aspiring nations, we probably won't have developed and large companies. We might have some primes, but predominantly there will be startup companies. So the private recommendations are really geared towards the startup ecosystems. So they get some recommendations that are actionable and that can be easily implemented. So those are two major audiences. Of course, ecosystem is much more complicated than that. There are other audiences like university sector, the social aspect of ecosystem, but these are the two biggest ones that we had in mind when we prepared this paper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Milicia. I believe we'll go to the final question from Suyin.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Sian Tan. I'm from the University of Waterloo, located in Toronto, Canada, and also ISU Global faculty member. Unfortunately, I was unable to travel this month, so I wasn't able to be on site with you at SHSSP. But I just wanted to mention that I'm originally from Papua New Guinea, which is quite close to you, and so I have an invested interest in the SHSSP and the Global South. My background is in space applications, so I'm a geographer, environmental scientist, and also an urban planner. So my interests are very much in remote sensing and navigation. So I was actually very interested in learning more about your project, and similar to what others have mentioned, congratulations on an excellent presentation. It was very professional, very TEDx-like, and easy to follow, very clear and comprehensive. Especially with your comments about equity for spacefaring nations. And I thought that you really approached this topic quite critically as well. I was very interested when reading your final report about the rubric that you have proposed as the maturity index. And you mentioned the 5 pillars of the space ecosystem, which is really core to your project. And my question is really about, well, are all of these 5 pillars equal? Or are maybe some of these pillars more important or essential than others? So when you're looking at your rubric and calculating this rubric, and I believe that you showed this diagram that was showing how this changes with different stages of maturity, I was wondering whether some of these pillars might change in weightings over time and maybe at different stages of maturity, because in your report, you've weighted them all equally. I was also wondering how nations can actually utilize this maturity index effectively. Is it that nations can utilize this to spot areas for increased funding, for example, or areas of particular focus? And I guess last maybe comment/question is that I found that when you were talking about developed, emerging, and aspiring countries, that these sort of lists for each of those categories seem to treat them a bit of a monolith. And we know that countries, even if they may all be aspiring, emerging, or developing, are all different. And I think as a geographer, I was wondering what the role of geography might play in that, because certain nations such as Australia might have access to launch sites, whereas other emerging nations may not. It also drives different needs of space technology, disaster management, for example, and national priorities. So those are just a couple of questions that I have. And again, congratulations on an excellent presentation.
Thank you for those questions. I think we'll answer those in 2 parts. Firstly, we'll talk about the rubric, the maturity level index, and then we will talk about how we apply that and how different nations with different geographies, as you said, can apply them. So I think for the rubric, we'll go to Francesca.
Thank you for the question. So you mentioned a very important point, which is the weighting of the 5 pillars. Of course, all of them are essential for a development, for the development of a space innovation ecosystem. So all of them have to be present. Now, as you mentioned, every country has different strengths, different geography, different priorities, national priorities. So then the weight of each parameters for each pillar, let's say, can, or the priority, can change in regard to which nation is considering to improve their ecosystems. What we seek to do with this white paper is to create an index, so a rubric, which the country can use to self-assess themselves, their position, understand where they stand in this scale between aspiring, developing, emerging, and developed, and then understand where to focus the resources. So it is true that in the report we equally weighted all of these parameters in the 5 pillars, but one of the objectives of the future work is to refine this maturity index and weight in a more, let's say, sophisticated way these parameters. So that will be a general index that every nation can use. And then based, to give them an understanding of where they stand. And then based on their national priorities, they can decide which to address first. But in general, there will be a weight, yes. So this is part of our future objectives. But we considered it, yeah. And
I think in relation to how we expect nations to utilise this as well, which was part of your second question posed there, we expect that nations will really utilise this in different ways at different times of their evolution through having a space ecosystem. So you'd notice in our final report there's a bit of a spider graph that we created to best show how interrelated these pillars are. There's a lot of crossover between these pillars, but they were based on the Luxembourg space ecosystem approach, which we found personally aligned to each of our disciplines that the team has, and gave us a more comprehensive way to address these, but we definitely believe that it will change significantly over time. For example, for a lot of aspiring nations, the political support pillar will be of greatest importance at the beginning, and as they begin to get a little bit further down the line in terms of development and research, they will then be able to look more towards the environmental side and education side to actually get these messages across to the rest of their communities as well.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure, do we have time for any more questions? Lots of time? Is there any more questions from in the room or online?
I have one question here. In the report, you have recommendations for the public side and the private side. And I just wonder if you have, if you thought about the role of basically like space enthusiasts or people who are trying to promote space activities in a country. Is it to channel those recommendations to the appropriate people, or what did you think about that?
Thanks, Eric, and that's a great point, actually. And we do mention some aspects of that ecosystem throughout communication pillar that we looked at, and that's probably in our report, I think it's under the government, but there is a big role of space enthusiasts, societies, industry associations that are all part of the ecosystem and have that role to promote as well. So I take your point. We didn't look any further in the role of the adjacent communities. So we did concentrate only on 2 pillars and two sectors. But that's a great point, and I think through the communication and outreach, that's a very powerful tool as well, and especially in aspiring nations that have limited funding. That's a great resource. So unfortunately, within our report, that was out of scope, but that's something that maybe we can take further through our IC paper and other research that we are intending to do.
Thank you, Milicia. I think we'll go to Juan on Zoom.
Hello, I'm Juan de Dalmau, a classmate of both Emmeline and Francois. It's great to see good old friends from 1989 still engaged with ISU. So I hope that 35 years from now, you will all still be engaged with ISU and contributing from the distance. I'm calling in from Barcelona. It's 31 minutes past midnight here, and I have enjoyed not only listening to your presentation and watching your beautiful video, but also reading the final report and the executive summary. I'm amazed at what a small group of people can do in less than 5 weeks. I've seen a very professional set of deliveries, all of them, and I think you deserve to present this at many conferences after the SHSSP. Since I am a representative of old space, let me ask you the following question, and I think it would be nice if we would have several participants answering from the policy side, from the legal side, from the satellite applications side, from the economic side of the following question, which comes from a target group that, from what I just heard, is not one of your priority targets. You mentioned governments and startups as the top target readers of your report. And when you say governments, we understand you mean aspiring governments. And we all know that aspiring space nations have small budgets for space today. And we know that startups usually have small budgets for space as well. So how do we get the wheel turning? So here is the question. Let's imagine that you are all from Kenya. You're all in Kenya, and you want to get Kenya to move fast from aspiring to emerging to a leading space nation. And you get a visit by old space people from a developed nation, could be Italy, could be the US, could be China. It's a delegation composed of government officials and old space companies, big, powerful companies. And they want to meet with leaders of your nation. And their proposal is that they are ready to invest hundreds of millions in Kenya to build a spaceport. They need access to a low-risk area to fly over. They need infrastructure. They need skilled people. They need services. You know what they need. And your role is to negotiate with these big old space guys and girls the best deal for your country. Now, while you start thinking about what you're going to answer, and it would be nice to really hear answers from all those who haven't spoken yet. It's just a suggestion. While you think about how you will get your negotiation organized and what you really want to get for your country out of this deal, I'll just introduce myself. Other than having studied at ISU, I have worked for the European Space Agency for many years, and I've had the pleasure of working with most of the faculty here, and I thank Scott Madrick for his patience. I see his hand is raised for so he's coming up with a very good question. Be ready for that one. And I have learned through the ISU really many things, how to work with people from everywhere, and how to recruit the best people through the network, And how to get to know the geography that Suyin is mentioning. Thanks to ISU, I've been all over the place as a lecturer, as a staff member. So I'm just encouraging you to really stay engaged with this network. It's a great investment you can make. Sorry for the long question, but it gave you thinking time, which is a good thing to have, isn't it? But I see that someone is ready with a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question, and thank you for the extra time as well that you provided for us to come up with an answer there. Very, very helpful. So you have heard from me already, but I'll just quickly add my little piece and I'll pass it around to some new faces as well. But essentially, one of the key aspects that we'd be looking at protecting in these aspiring nations is the intellectual property side. So one of the bits that we went into quite heavily as part of our public-driven recommendations was to protect the intellectual property of these nations. So we really did want to prioritise international collaborations, but have any technology created as a result with the property rights given to the aspiring nation in the hopes of building the capabilities for them to be a bigger player in that particular niche in the future. So that's something that we really wanted to focus on, and obviously getting intellectual property rights in themselves can be quite expensive. So we also wanted to build some framework, some legal framework around how either international nations that are considered more developed in terms of their space ecosystem, or the local government of the aspiring nation can actually assist financially in making that happen. So I'll pass over to my colleague, Vedika, who will provide a little bit more information for you.
Thank you very much for your question, and thank you for the delegation who has visited us. We are quite prepared for you. One of the things that we will insist on is a very strong educational transfer or knowledge transfer. We would like to build this capability within Kenya. We would also like to progress the education sector. And along with that, a very strong outreach program. We have quite a few challenges in the country, and we believe that through this program, we would be able to reach quite a number of communities. So that is also something we would insist on. Thank you.
I just want to welcome you to Kenya. I am from Kenya. But to speak to some pre-processes that we would need to do as a country, and the one and most important one is to quantify our resources and contribution to the space industry and ecosystem. One of the main reasons there's been a lot of inequality in how contributions are compensated is that lack of understanding. What is the value that we're giving into the space ecosystem, and how can we continue to increase that? So we would have a very good understanding of that before we sit at that table and negotiate. And in terms of access, infrastructure, and services, government's role is to prioritize which sectors are developed at any given point, and where there's clear return of investment within those areas, we would invest heavily, given the understanding of the contribution, the investment that you bring would have on the country, and its people as well, who are extremely important. We don't have the privilege, or emerging countries don't have the privilege, as you very rightly mentioned, to spend on research for the sake of research. It has to be very applicable to solving the problems of the nation, poverty, famine, hunger as well. So looking at how the space industry, as well as the investment that would be coming into the country, how those would address the predominant issues that we have.
And just another pillar to address is really the economical development of the country. So when the big old space comes to Kenya, we need to ensure that Kenyan's companies are part of the supply chain. And that's potentially can be challenging, especially when the industry is not there and industry needs to be upskilled. But one of the requirements really from Kenyan governments would be to actually have a Kenyan supply chain sustain within the big infrastructure build. So that will be one of the requirements that will be a must for the project. The other one is also how the infrastructure would fit in overall infrastructure in Kenya. So if we are building a spaceport and putting all of the electricity and the networks and internet, we want to develop the regions as well of Kenya to benefit out of that infrastructure project. So that will also be a must for Kenyan development. And the other thing also is this sustainability. So we don't want the big old space to come to Kenya and then after 5 years pull out of Kenya and have nothing for Kenya in. So one thing is also looking at how to build the Kenyan space ecosystem and industry so that it can sustain itself even after the big guns are out. So that will be our requirement, unless someone has anything else. Yeah, there is another.
Thank you. That was really, yeah, I wanted to stress this point that it's important to have a short-term but also a long-term plan, because you want the old space countries with a lot of expertise to guide the growth of these new country such that they can slowly let go, and the country that is receiving the support in the beginning can then grow with their own skills and their own capabilities, the money that was invested, and then partner with these older, with these other partners for more ambitious projects later on.
I hope that has answered your question adequately. I believe we have time for one last question from Scott.
Hey guys, wonderful to see you all. You look great. You clean up really well. I'm impressed. I have one quick question I would like to ask. First of all, I would say that I had very high expectations, and you have exceeded those, not only in your presentation, which I thought was extremely strong, but also the questions, your ability to answer the questions this evening, I think were really very well done. My question is, you're about to discover that there actually is life after ISU, and is something we've all gone through. But my question to you is really quite simple, and yet it's really complex. We've had many TPs which have gone on to have very significant lives of their own after ISU, and have taken root and have grown and become real projects in the space world. So I wanted to ask, what have you what thought have you given to what comes next for this project? I think it's an excellent project that has a lot to offer. And so what are your plans? What are your thoughts and hopes for taking this to the next step after you all go home?
I think I will start answering this question. So we've proposed this maturity level index in our report and throughout our presentation. And due to the limited time, we were only able to do 3 case studies. But ideally, we want to flesh this out into something that will be able to be applied by any stakeholder that is interested in building a space ecosystem. And I think that's one of the main things that we want to focus on. But Darcy has more contribution.
So we've definitely put a lot of thought into where we would like to take this project next. Obviously, we want to take the current project that we've worked on, but we've got a couple of areas that we'd like to improve on. So as Leon just said, our maturity index, we want to include other international examples, as well as working on the weighting, which was mentioned in a question previously, just so that we can offer some different angles for nations at different levels to actually have something more applicable to their current situations. We also wanted to look into risk assessments for future financial viability. So obviously we've heard from a lot of organisations that they're hoping to do space tourism and film movies and all these incredible different applications up in space. However, we don't know if the market will necessarily be there. So as part of our investigation into new space, we want to look into what are the potential risks involved in these future sectors that have been proposed. And our final little bit that we've suggested so far is looking into the private partnerships. looking at the PPP in terms of developing nations and avoiding that corruption further, and how that might actually play a really big role in some of the recommendations that we've proposed. They're sort of our 3 key directions that we've identified so far, but hopefully we'll get some feedback today that might even further direct that. So always open to suggestions, Scott.
Okay, I think that's the last question that we had time for. Thank you very much.
Very, very well done. I was moved and overwhelmed. This is my first TP. I'm not the academic in the room. I am, like one said, I'm old space. I appreciate the message. I actually, the phrase that kept coming in my head was a call to arms. There's this message, there's a story here. And so I'm not going to ask the question to answer it, but if I wasn't old space, if I'm just Joe citizen, what are you asking me to do? How can I help? So just think about as you take the message forward. You know, Melissa's answer to Philomena's question was we're targeting government. Eric poked a little bit on space enthusiasts, which there are a lot out there, but there's a lot of people who aren't. We know governments are governments and big corporations are big corporations. You just think about how do you take this call of arms and turn it into a groundswell movement? How do you make it not just a report, but carry it into the future? I saw the waves here on the ocean, get a big wave started somehow. So that's my action to you guys, is figure out how to do that and take the message in all the places that'll take you and listen to you. So very good. I appreciate all that. We now need to pause and take a break. We're gonna swap over and reset for the next TP, the Artemis group. I think our assessors, we have an action to go upstairs and meet, so we need you guys to go upstairs and do that. I think everybody else take a break. At this point, I think we're spot on time, so very good job there. And I think there's probably still some stuff out on the table, coffee and tea for the visitors. But congratulations, take a deep breath. You've done well. Welcome back, everybody. We are excited to head into our second TP presentation of the day, where Rebecca Raposi will kick us off here in a second. But first, I would like to acknowledge we did have a late arrival, somebody that actually has a birthday today, Mr. Michael Davis. And so congratulations to Michael Davis on his birthday. Anyway, so great excitement, great energy. Really appreciate the presentation this morning, and we're looking forward to hearing about the Artemis TP as well. I will now turn it over to Rebecca and let her get started. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, James, for the presentation. I'm here to introduce you to the project the Artemis team has realized in the previous week and entitled Journey to the Moon, Technological and Legal Perspectives for Sustainable Human Presence. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge on behalf of the team the country that we meet on today as traditional land for the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and future, and we recognize their cultural and spiritual relationship with their land. Now, Journey to the Moon. This is the title we have decided to give to our project because in our mind, this is an additional piece to the global discussion about how to come back to the moon and how to develop a long-term, so sustainable, peaceful human presence there. 50 years after the Apollo missions, several national and international government programs are working in this direction. The two major examples are the Artemis program and the Chinese-Russian International Lunar Research Station project. At the same time, there are several commercial lunar companies which are interested in going to the moon and set their operations there. However, as we look towards this new era of the space exploration and we try to achieve these, several challenges arise. From the technology development required to overcome the harsh lunar environment, to addressing legal and ethical consideration related to the fact that many international players will exploit the lunar soil, many issues have to be considered. How are we practically going to achieve this long-term human presence on the moon? Which are the activities we have to develop in situ? Which is the legal framework in which all of this is going to happen? We have tried to answer with our project these and many other questions. This work is the culmination of the 5 weeks Southern Hemisphere Space Study Program by the International Space University hosted at the Mawson Lake campus of the University of South Australia in Adelaide. This work is the result of the of the effort of 19 people coming from different countries and whose background goes from medicine, engineering, management, law, policy. We have tried to combine our previous knowledge with the lessons received during the course. And we have tried to cover different topics, creating several interdisciplinary links. As you will see during the presentation, we will cover space engineering, management and business, space application, law, and many topics. Now, which is our vision? The idea that we have always had in mind while working to the project is to achieve one day and create a sustainable Earth-Moon ecosystem with permanent human presence on the moon, poised to be the starting point for the humanity expansion into the solar system. Therefore, the mission that this project has is to provide a series of comprehensive recommendations, both from a technological and legal point of view, so that we can achieve this long-term human settlement there. But how have we practically operated to realize this project? First of all, we have decided to focus on the history of the lunar exploration in the past 70 years and to analyze the current industry space scenario. Then we have identified which are the major requirements, particularly on a technological point of view, in order to realize the human presence on the moon. And we have identified as three main factors the resources like power, in situ resource utilization, and habitation. And finally, we have redefined the legal framework for the regulation of the space activities. Now, having said this, I would like to leave the stage to my colleague Francesco and to the other presenter, and I invite all of you, both here and online, to enjoy this journey into the lunar exploration.
Thanks, Rebecca. So, let's start this journey. Humanity has always been fascinated by the moon, which has inspired both science and our collective imagination. Many countries, such as the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and India, have made the moon a target for their space missions. But why explore the moon? Lunar exploration is crucial for various reasons. Firstly, it can provide an exceptional opportunity to investigate the geology and history of our Earth. Secondly, it can be used as a platform to test and develop advanced technologies and systems that will be necessary for future space exploration, as life support systems or resource utilization. Thirdly, the moon contains valuable resources, such as water and minerals, that can support future human activities in space. And lastly, establishing a continuous human presence on the moon has the potential to boost innovation and economic growth that will be the base for future commercial activities and space tourism. Lunar exploration started with the Soviet Luna mission in 1959. But it was the US Apollo 11 mission in 1969 that marked the historical milestone for humanity, bringing the first man on the lunar surface. Since then, other nations have sent probes, landers, and rovers on the moon to gather scientific information. And today, we now have multiple governments that have programs focused on bringing humanity back on the moon permanently. And the main differences between the past and the modern space endeavors is that commercial companies are becoming increasingly involved in these programs, offering services and infrastructure for space travel, as well as technological solutions. For instance, NASA is collaborating with Dynetics, SpaceX, and Blue Origin for the future human landing for the lunar exploration. Today, the two main governmental programs that aims to bringing the humans back on the moon are Artemis and the International Lunar Research Station. Let's talk about first Artemis. Artemis, led by NASA, is a program that aims to establish a reliable and sustainable lunar exploration through the international collaboration and partnership with space industries. Artemis is made by several missions. Among them, Artemis 1 has already successfully carried out the uncrewed flight test of the Space Launch Systems and the Orion spacecraft. Artemis 2 will be the first crewed flight test. Artemis 3 has the goal of landing the first woman and the first person of color on the moon by 2025. And with Artemis 4, the sustained human presence on the moon will be established through the expansion of infrastructure with the Gateway, that is a habitable lunar orbiting space station that will be the base for future robotics and human missions to the moon and beyond. And in addition, we have also other already planned and proposed missions in this program. On the other hand, we have the International Lunar Research Station, which is a significant collaboration between two space agencies, the Chinese National Space Administration and the Russian State Space Corporation. This project aimed to establish a permanent and fully autonomous research station on the moon. And with 5 different missions, the goal is to conduct a wide range of scientific research and experimentation, as well as the verification of all the technologies that will be useful for the future human and robotic missions. And the aim is to study the lunar South Pole and the environment. And one important point to underline is that these two space agencies seek to attract global partners in this project to increase our understanding of the moon. Further comparison between these two programs will be addressed by the next colleague, Kunal.
Thank you. So I'll be comparing the two major programs that are out there, Artemis and ILOS. It is seen that Artemis, before the establishment of Gateway, has a focus on in having the first astronauts on the lunar surface, compared to ILOS, whose priority is a robotic scientific survey. Possible landing sites have been identified by both Artemis and ILOS in the lunar South Pole. But for Artemis, those landing sites are just landing sites, compared to ILOS, where the sites need to satisfy and be suitable for a lunar base station. Also, Artemis is more open for commercial collaboration for critical subsystems, such as launch vehicles and landing systems. And through the Artemis Accords, it is seen that there's a lot of collaboration between the spacefaring nations, and those accords provide a framework of principles to be followed on the moon, something ILOS doesn't currently have. But ILOS, as we said earlier, is more focused on robotic scientific exploration of the lunar surface. What it's doing is following up previous missions such as Chang'e and Luna by the Chinese and the Russians, which aim to go to the lunar South Pole, find and collect samples and send them back to the moon, and test new critical technologies that will be required for ILOS. Furthermore, ILOS has a big payload that's available for different actors. Those actors could be developing nations. And those nations may already have links with China through initiatives such as the Belt and Road one. If we look at both of the programs, it is seen that they are going parallel with each other. This is probably due to the Wilf Amendment that prevents NASA from collaborating with the Chinese government and other Chinese organizations. It is projected that Artemis, for now, will be first on the lunar surface, according to the timeline provided. But the ILOS one, even though the timelines are blurry, there has been an internal push by the Chinese government to match that of Artemis. Once on the lunar surface, there might be the need for international collaboration, probably through common protocols to mitigate any safety concerns that might arise due to the harsh environment present. Irrespective of all the politics behind any programs, in order to be successful, the programs need to have an adequate power system, which my colleague Ricardo will go more about.
Thanks, colleague. Okay, so we can start in the beginning with say, power is to humanity what blood is to us. So we can start the journey here. Resource utilization. Now I ask you, if power is the blood of us, the blood of cities, the blood of civilization, we can say a lot of context with the ISS. The ISS is the International Space Station, a very huge space station, but it's going on every 90 minutes around the Earth. 45 of those minutes is in permanent light. Exactly, and very useful for solar power, but 45 minutes is in permanent darkness. So how to address these minutes in darkness periods if we need constant energy? They use batteries, lithium-ion batteries, based on commercial technology. Now, we can see in the picture the dark period and the light period. So with this in mind, we can ask the question, how much power do we need if we want to go to the moon? We are going to address these stars with generation, storage, and distribution. So let me ask you, how much power do we need? Nothing? All? Or maybe just enough? Well, let me go to the moon. Light on the moon. Okay. One Earth day, it's not one moon day. A moon day, it's based on 28 Earth days. So if we can see the progression here, we are going to see black, and then it's apparently go evolution with the cycle. So we can see that in the Ecuador, 40 days is going to be in permanent light, and 40 days are going to be in permanent darkness. But in the pole, we can see that the major of time is going to have light, but it's not going to be eternal. So let me talk that last word, because we are going to target where on the moon? We are going to go to the peaks of eternal light. very poetic name, but it's not eternal. In the best situation, we are going to have 2 days of permanent darkness. In the worst scenario, we are going to have 2 weeks. So this is a huge problem. We are going to need to have power for 2 days, 2 weeks. So we are going to address this by saying that we are going to go with solar generation and radiothermal generations, because solar is ideal. If we are going to go in the best scenario, we can have a lot of power. RTG makes energy and makes us heat, but it's not going to be permanent. We have these base technologies that are functioning today. This is why we choose these technologies. But what about the future? So in the storage, we are going to use the self-contained spacecraft. It's have their solar panels. It's going to have their lithium batteries. So we are going to use that batteries to first make our first solar station. Then we are going to address the problems of all the infrastructure that it's need to have water, air, and rocket fuel, because we are going to go permanent. So in the future, in the middle term, we are going to use hydrogen fuel cells that are capable to generate not only water, but it's going to use the same fuel of the rocket, and it's going to produce heat. So they are a very good source. Those technologies, it's today. It's not for tomorrow, it's from today. They need to develop more, but it's today's technologies that have been proved. So the distribution would be in smart grids. We now have independent, highly reliable rovers with solar panels and lithium batteries, but we need a smart grid. We need the power where we need it, how much we need it. So we are going to address these things by a roadmap that is basically in the near term. Right now, we have highly independent solar panels, rovers, and we need temporal habitats. Then we are going to develop the small grids we need. Near independent, but we need to start experimenting with the technology to, in the far future, get with all the infrastructure needed to stay there. Rocket fuel, water, and let me go, because this is our second shot. It's our second shot to go to the moon and stay there. We have the technology just good enough, but we need to do experiment there in situ. That's why I will leave you with my colleague Kuhn.
Thanks, Ricardo. So, good morning, everyone. So, I'm going to cover some of the technical aspects today. As defined in the ISRU scope, sustainability is to minimize the cost and efforts from the Earth and to maximize the profits and benefits from the Moon. The profits and benefits do not cover only the monetary terms, but more importantly, on the lessons, learnings, and innovations of science and technology related to manufacturing, robotics and transportation, power, habitats, resourcing, and so much more. Robotics and transportation are essential technologies which have been playing and will keep playing the important role of resource exploitation and space exploration. So here's a picture of how a future rover may look like and how robotics transportation will help with sustaining this mission. So they can be independent explorers operating in environments too distant or hostile for humans, compensating for the restricted surface and mobility for humans on the moon surface. And they can run in separate missions. They can be precursor systems operating before the crewed missions, and humans are needed elsewhere. They can be left behind, helping and be caretakers. And here's our recommendations for robotics and transportation. Within the ISRU scope, the robotics transportation are defined to identify the optimum sites for lunar mining and human habitats. With the semi-autonomous robotics transportation technologies, they are mature enough to perform such tasks on the moon. So in the near term, those will be zoning for exploitation, resource quantification, and with increasing robotics exploitation, we should be able to achieve our midterm goal of having advanced in situ exploitation and transportation technologies. That means robots will be able to collect and perform sample analysis in situ with reduced human input and increasing efficiency and reduce the lead time. So rovers don't have to be on wheels. So we can build more advanced transportation infrastructure, for example, roads, charging stations, and this will automatically boost the robotics scaling up and lead to our long-term goal of having a fully automatic robotics and transportation network. Manufacturing. Another very important technology factor is manufacturing. With the current technologies and practices on Earth, lunar activities rely heavily on essential and replacement parts from Earth that poses high mass maintenance requirements and low sparing efficiency. What does that mean? So 95% of the parts we brought from Earth to the Moon may not be used at all. So before Earth's launches can be reduced to the on-Earth transportation costs, well, I doubt it will ever maybe or even anywhere close. The only way to achieve sustainability is to have on-demand fabrication repair, make it a don't take it, and having recycling of the consumables. In other words, in situ resource utilization and in-space manufacturing. And there are many ways of manufacturing. AM, short for additive manufacturing, is believed to be one of the best candidates because it's the best usage of material. So AM can be used to make tools and replacement parts with complex geometries for manufacturing facilities, alleviating the supply chain, reduce the lead time. AM can be used to produce construction and shielding materials from lunar regoliths for human habitats and infrastructure. And more importantly, in-space manufacturing, including AM, can also benefit Earth by taking advantage of the unique lunar conditions. For example, I can imagine 3D printing of titanium may not need a chamber because we don't need a chamber to generate the vacuum anymore. Well, there will be many more technology challenges that we cannot foresee at this stage. More testing, validation, and even modification will have to be done to move the in-space manufacturing one step further. So here's our recommendation for in-space manufacturing. In the near term, feedstock and manufacturing facilities will have to be brought from Earth to the Moon, requiring many Earth launches, significant costs and resources. When manufacturing technologies can be tested and validated on the Moon, then we can hit our midterm of having lunar resources 100% feedstock for manufacturing. This will reduce significantly of the Earth launches and further improving the sustainability of the long-term lunar program. And this will change again. If we can scale up our manufacturing facilities, then we can achieve our long-term goal of having a full self-supporting model. And that means we can minimize Earth launches. We produce components with sample manufacturing facilities on the Moon. We produce construction and shielding materials for human habitats. And by that time, Lunar City is not a dream anymore. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Hayden to talk about lunar habitats.
Thanks, Kun. So I'm going to talk about human habitation. How do we live on the Moon? There are 4 main points we need to consider talking about this. First of all, the situation. What is planned so far in terms of habitation? What are those habitats going to have to contend with on the lunar surface? How are we going to protect our astronauts from hazards of the lunar environment? And beyond that, how do we keep them happy and healthy? So the situation so far, I'm going to be focusing on Artemis because we have the most information about it, especially in terms of lunar habitation. So NASA's Artemis Base Camp is planned to comprise a pressurized habitat and a pressurized rover, plus an unpressurized rover, capable of supporting a maximum of 4 crew, 2 in the HAB, 2 in the rover. Gateway should be able to support up to 4 crew maximum in the iHab and Halo modules. And it's worth mentioning that SpaceX's Starship, intended as a transit vehicle, is large enough and capable enough to support up to 100 people on long-distance journeys to the Moon and perhaps to Mars, so it could be considered a habitat in its own right. So here's we've got the concepts of the lunar habitat on the right and the pressurized rover on the left. Both of these have a capacity of 2 crew. And here's a blow-up of Gateway. The rocket is not to scale, unfortunately. But you can see there are a lot of contributors to this. We've got NASA, ESA, the Canadian Space Agency will be contributing another Canadarm, which ties in with, can talk about robotics. We've got commercial contributors like SpaceX, Maxar, and Northrop Grumman, so it's a huge undertaking. So what do we have to contend with on the lunar surface? First and foremost, radiation. This is capable of damaging organic molecules, leading to various health defects. In the most extreme case, things like cancer. So for extended stays, you do not want a lot of exposure to this. The lunar dust is a pervasive issue. It is sticky, toxic, abrasive, and every Apollo mission that took astronauts to the moon complained of problems with the lunar dust. Moonquakes are generally weaker than seismic activity we experience on Earth, but they are notable. Some of them can be quite large, and of course, they will raise dust. Micrometeoroids. Now, the moon does not have an atmosphere, or it does, it's a very thin one called an exosphere, but it means that small objects do not burn up before impacting like they would on Earth, which makes impacts from micrometeoroids a much more frequent occurrence. They have the potential, obviously, to puncture habitat holes if they are not strong enough. Temperature changes. The temperature on the moon between night and day varies by about 300 degrees Celsius. So any habitats, any equipment we leave there is going to experience a lot of thermal expansion and contraction, which could cause ruptures in habitat holes if they're not prepared for it. So how do we deal with these? Radiation can be blocked with a thick enough shield. Really, the only problem is making the shield thick enough. Dust, because of its shape, there is research into repelling it by texturing the outer walls of habitats to reduce contact area. But as the dust can also be charged by the photoelectric effect, we are also looking into electrostatic repulsion for the walls of habitats. Moonquakes, to combat these, we simply need to design habitats for stability and strength. Micrometeoroids, same kind of thing as radiation. We need a thick hull to resist impacts, minimize the damage done, reduce the risk of a breach. Temperature changes. The materials we construct our surface equipment from have to have a good tolerance for extreme temperatures. And if they do experience thermal expansion and contraction, they need to be elastic enough to accommodate that without shattering. So we've protected our astronauts. How do we keep them alive? Life support systems have to supply food and water, they have to clean the air, deal with waste, and protect the crew from hazards, which we just talked about. So initially, this is going to be almost totally reliant on Earth. Resupply missions to Gateway will supply astronauts on the moon with food and water, but we can move over time to a more closed system, something that does more recycling, doesn't have much of a reliance on outside sources. So the ISS lays the foundations for this. There's water recycling, atmosphere control, and waste management we can use. They're applicable. We can also mine water from PSRs, permanently shadowed regions, which is one of the objectives of the Artemis missions program. And crops have been grown in lunar soil. So with the right kind of module, we can actually have a farm on the moon. We can provide food in situ. So our recommendations. The Artemis Base Camp, the ABC, can be expanded using additional modules from Earth to increase crew capability for surface operations. Now, we can use additive manufacturing, like Kun talked about, to construct shells of the lunar regolith around pre-built habitat modules, and this will mitigate most of the hazards from the lunar surface. It will block a decent amount of radiation, it will insulate habitats from temperature changes, provide additional protection against micrometeoroids, provide stability against moonquakes, and also protects most of the outer walls of the habitat against dust, but airlocks will still be at risk. Water mined on the moon can be used for in-situ resource utilization. We can give it to the crew as part of a life support system, or we can split it into hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen can be used in atmosphere systems, and the hydrogen, as Ricardo mentioned, can be used in hydrogen fuel cells. So there's that. Life support systems already present on the ISS may help lunar settlements to migrate from open to almost completely closed life support systems. vastly reducing reliance on resupplies from the Earth, which will bring down the number of launches we need, reduce the amount of money that's spent on actually supporting such a settlement. And we can farm. There's crops have been grown in lunar soil, so initially this will just be an experiment, but once the capabilities build up enough, once the settlement has expanded, then we can have an actual lunar farm providing food to astronauts without resupply. And beyond that, again, using additive manufacturing, we can look into manufacturing entire structures on the moon rather than delivering them, potentially from regolith, potentially from regolith extracts. But another solution to environmental hazards lies in lava tubes. Now, by virtue of being underground, they bypass a lot of the dangers of the surface. They are insulated against radiation and extreme temperatures. It's believed that because impacts are responsible for the shape of the dust, there may be less dust in the lava tubes than on the surface. Additionally, by being underground, we also remove the risk of micrometeorite impacts almost completely. However, moonquakes are going to be a lot more of an issue because you have a roof of rock above you that can come crashing down at any moment. So some key takeaways from this point. The ISS lays the foundations for a lot of this. Power systems will be applicable, particularly in the near future with small settlements, but obviously as those settlements grow, we're going to need smart grids, we're going to need radiothermal power generation. Robotics is going to be useful. They can zone and survey resources. Canadarm, the robotic arm on the ISS, has a successor planned for Gateway as well. Habitation will start small. We can expand using pre-built modules from Earth. We can reinforce them with regolith using ISRU, and that also extends to life support using water for oxygen and also for power, hydrogen fuel cells, and we can grow crops in the lunar soil. I think I mentioned that enough. So that leaves us with the question of how do we conduct ourselves while we're doing this? How do we behave? How do we settle disputes? How do we cooperate when we're doing this? So to talk about this, I would like to hand over to my colleague Tom, who will take you through some of the legal aspects of this project.
Thanks, mate. Right, so we've established our tool set. Now let's talk about our rule set. This image was taken at the end of November last year. It shows the Orion spacecraft approaching the Earth-Moon system during its orbital flight. This is the first time since the Apollo era that a human-rated spacecraft has orbited the moon. These things are happening now, they're happening quickly, and it's thrilling. But every time we engage in a sort of, I suppose, a runaway ambition, it's good to check our step and to make sure we don't rush in and do things wrong. So this next phase is in motion. What sort of activity can we expect? Scientific exploration, touched on by my teammates, is really driving Artemis, and it's driving other international ambitions on the moon. In situ resource utilization, construction for power, for transport, and novel niches. So we have these enormous intergovernmental programs that are heading to the lunar space. In the long term, these are the tip of the spear. It is likely in the way that humans pursue creative ways to enter into new spaces, it is likely that commercial entities will enter into the lunar space in the wake of these programs. So there's enormous technical and financial challenge. Collaboration is vital. In that Orion spacecraft image, and it was framed very deliberately, we had the ESA and the NASA logos displayed very prominently alongside each other. A recent report from the Office of the Inspector General at NASA highlighted yet again that even a behemoth entity like NASA, for it to do something like it intends to do on the moon with Artemis, it poses enough of a challenge in such a hostile environment that collaboration is still absolutely critical. So as we enter this space, what sort of scenarios can we anticipate as outcomes from our behaviors? Orbital debris is a big one. It doesn't take a lot for launches and landings to kick up little bits of regolith, little parts of the moon's surface, and send them into orbital trajectories. Could we see competition for limited resources? As many entities converge on the moon, they'll be looking for things to use up there. convergence at unique strategic regions. This is already going on. The Artemis program, the ILRS, have identified overlapping potential landing zones near permanently shaded regions at the South Pole. And we can see disputes over tenements and land use. Who works where? Where can I go? Can I approach where you're working? How do we zone land for commercial exploitation, for scientific exploration, for heritage or protection of natural assets? Now, from this, we could get the development of critical scenarios if things are done incorrectly. By critical scenarios, I mean scenarios where you severely compromise our ability to sustain a human presence on the surface of the moon. Things like excessive debris in orbit that makes launching and landing humans from the surface a very unsafe thing to do, more unsafe than it already is. And maybe mismanagement of critical resources in strategic regions, rendering future habitation at those sites unfeasible. So if I'm going to the moon and I want to conduct myself there in some manner, I want to also have the assurance that other parties entering that space are going to be following some fundamental set of principles that we all share. This is the basis of trust and allows collaborative initiatives to take place. And it also removes a bit of fog around intent. And it means that when we come to dispute resolution, it can be done in a more efficient manner. So this can be formulated in a legal question. How can we structure the landscape of international space law to most effectively encourage cooperation in lunar activity, and further, to ensure a sustained human presence on the surface of the moon? Currently, the landscape of international space law is like this, and it's a fairly successful arrangement for the time being. The Outer Space Treaty in 1967 came in at the dawn of the space era and laid the foundational principles that we still abide by today. Following this were a series of agreements and conventions that sussed out some of the details in terms of more specific behaviors, and the administration and management of these treaties, brought bodies, international bodies like UN Office for Outer Space Affairs and UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And very recently, we've had the Artemis Accords come in. So this framework was laid out over 50 years ago. Its foundational principles, to some extent, they're timeless. They will continue to underwrite our activities up there. The Moon Agreement was not signed by most countries. So there's a piece of international law that is not, I suppose, underwriting collective behaviors across the board. And the Artemis Accords is project aligned. It was not done by the UN. It was done with the intention of addressing some of these emerging issues. So our approach draws upon the merits of existing framework. We decided we needed a system that is dynamic and adaptable and incorporates sectorial diversity into the decision-making process, so we hear all stakeholder voices, but it gives states primacy. We asked how could things look, and we produced a think piece, not something to be shoehorned into the real world to replace existing bodies and treaties. We arrived at a two-tiered system comprising a living document treaty and a committee to oversee and sustain the treaty's function and its relevance. Adi, who is right here, will take you through the details of this two-tiered system.
Thank you so much, Tom. So after looking at all the legal treaties and the international law as it is, as it stands, we came up with a model that had to solve all the issues that are already there. So what if there is conflict on the moon? What if there's any problem over there? What if there are disputes over there? Because if we talk about the moon, there are, of course, limited resources on that particular area. So if multiple parties converge at the strategic locations which are there would definitely be conflicts. And we do not have any international mechanism to answer these questions. What we do have are a set of principles. For example, the Outer Space Treaty, which, of course, it's not a full-fledged treaty. And other treaties that we do have, such as the Liability Convention, or, for example, the Rescue Convention, they are very specific. So other things that we have in international laws, that they are non-binding guidelines, but of course they are not treaties and they are not binding on the parties. So what we had to focus on was to create a new system that could potentially resolve these issues. So we created a two-tiered lunar governance system in which our main aim was to resolve potential issues that may occur on the moon. We have utilized present international legal models. We have looked at international law as it is. We have looked at multiple treaties. We have looked at multiple international organizations as they stand right now, including legislative frameworks of countries, and we have innovated on them to create this lunar governance system. Now, the idea of the system arose from the fact that the treaties that are made, they remain static for a long period of time. So we had to create a living document which would address problems as and when they arose. And of course, we have used multiple approaches to international law to devise our system. Now, as I told you, the system is based on two tiers. The first one, of course, is the Lunar Activities Treaty, which would be the primary tier. Its membership, of course, would be limited to nation states, because in international law, states are the primary actors and the primary benefactors. We have modeled on the Antarctic Treaty System and the ISS Intergovernmental Agreement. I will discuss that in the next slide. And we have made sure that it is inherently a living document which can be updated again and again as and when any problem arises. Now, we base this particular treaty on the Antarctic Treaty System because the Antarctic Treaty System was created through the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. And even today, it is very much relevant. Of course, there are some lacunas in the Antarctic Treaty System itself, but we have tried to resolve them, such as its expiry date. And of course, the Intergovernmental Agreement of the ISS, which is the second thing, is another international treaty which specifically addresses problems in outer space. And we included this in our work. Of course, we have also focused on the primacy of states. The Lunar Activities Treaty has multiple features which should be attractive to nations. It promotes sustainability. It promotes scientific exploration and prevents militarization of space and on the moon. It establishes the Committee Overseeing Lunar Resources, that is COLA, which I'll be discussing in the next slide, and enforces its mandates. And the living system is specifically created in this treaty through Article 9. Now, the second tier of our system, of course, the first one is a treaty. The second one is an organization. So the second one is the Committee Overseeing Lunar Activities, which we have abbreviated as COLA. It's based on multiple international organizations, such as the ILO, the International Labour Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations systems, such as ECOSOC. Of course, the list is not exhaustive, and we have looked at multiple systems to create this organization. It will have the three main organs, that is the Secretariat, the Decision-Making Council, and the Dispute Resolution Body. Each has its own functions, whereas the Secretariat will be looking into the daily, day-to-day work of the organization. The Decision-Making Council will have multiple stakeholders, which will give advisories to be ratified by the primary nations. And of course, the Dispute Resolution Body is a unique aspect, which is not addressed under any international treaty right now, which we are looking into. So this one is the first tier. Of course, I've already given the model. This particular treaty will give primacy to states, while the Committee Overseeing Lunar Activities will have its multiple organs, and it will have the membership, if you can see over there, of states, corporates, employees, NGOs, and academia. Recommendations will be given by this organization, which would have to be ratified by the other countries. So just to summarize, LAT is, of course, the primary tier. The organization is the secondary tier. And COLA, of course, has holistic representation because we have included multiple parties in this, and this gives us a lot of benefits. But we have to clarify that we are limited here to creating a codified dream, and a lot of work has already been done in this respect when it comes to international law, and the real-world integration would be utterly subjective. But we, of course, hope that this will start a discussion. So to conclude the legal part, we have analyzed the gaps in international space law with respect to lunar activities. Our model should help in resolving the issues that may take place on the lunar environment. The model is multilateral in nature and comprises of a treaty system and a holistic international organization. And of course, issues that come up on the moon in the coming years can continuously be addressed with inputs from relevant actors. I'll give the floor to Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you, Adi. And thanks to all the presenters and you who have listened to the presentation. I hope you have enjoyed this journey. Now, since we have touched many different topics, I would like to provide here a summary of what we have done in this project. First of all, we have studied the history of the lunar exploration, and we have focused on the current scenario, in particular, highlighting the possible concerns that might rise due to the competitions between the Artemis and IRS programs. Then we have defined which are the fundamental requirements in terms of technology needed to achieve a permanent human settlement on the moon. So we have talked about power, in-situ resource utilization, and habitation. Finally, we have redefined the legal framework needed to regulate the future of the space exploration. Before concluding, I would like to acknowledge all the people and institutions who made this project and program possible. All the Artemis team is extremely grateful to our TP chair, Eric Dalston, and to Frank Papa, teaching assistant. We really appreciate all the help you have given us. Then I would like to thank the International Space University and the University of South Australia, in particular all the ISU staff members, the faculty, professors, and all the people who have helped us with the project. Finally, last but not least, all the sponsors that have participated to the SHSSP23. We really appreciate what you have done for all of us. Now, to conclude, with this project, we have shown you that the future of the space exploration requires a lot of effort. By addressing some of the technological and legal challenges, we wanted to pave the way for a prosperous and peaceful future of the humankind on the moon. Our hope is that with this project, the same doubts and the same questions we have been questioning ourselves in the last weeks, one day will rise also in other institutions, and that this project will be the solid base for further consideration, so that all the humankind can reach the goal that is now chasing, that is going back to the moon and bring the humanity there. Thank you for your attention. Now, if you have some questions, the panelists will be happy to answer all your doubts. And yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, everybody. So, please, you have a microphone? Yeah. Please start the question.
I'm going to have to ask one because no one else has got one. In the technological challenges, one of the perceived bigger challenges is obviously a cislunar communication system. I just wondered why, did you look at that early on and decided not to put that in scope, or you were focusing very much on the surface kind of constraints?
Sure, thank you. So it's about the scope of the research.
Yes, so early on, we knew we had to narrow down what we were going to do, because describe humanity's future on the moon is not easy to fit into 42 pages. We decided to focus primarily on surface operations and what would be needed to facilitate and sustain those, which is why we didn't really consider any kind of communication network on the moon itself or between the moon and Earth and Gateway. So really, it's just what we felt we had to cover in the time available.
Thank you.
I wanted to congratulate you for a very comprehensive presentation. Also, the two major parts of it, one, the roadmap for human habitation, and the other one, the legal framework. I feel like they're both so massive, they could probably each make one a TP. So that was very well done. I'm interested in especially looking at the legal framework and the the status quo of that, and given that the actual missions to the moon are all in the pipeline and they're happening very soon, how you feel, and I know that this might not be something that you can answer very tangibly, how do you feel we're getting the major geopolitical powers on a table these days to create such a lunar activities treaty, given the current circumstances, and what do you think might be impetuses for that in order to make that happen?
Thanks. So it's about the implementation of the treaty.
Thank you for the question. That is pretty much what we tried to focus on. Is the question is, how do you solve world peace in the TP timeframe that we had? So instead of drilling down on specifics of all of the treaties, which we went through, we decided to come up with a model that may be able to address these issues and these points head on, such as how do you find an accord between conflicting countries? And we went right back and not only looked through the treaties and accords, we also looked at patterns in history where there was two common denominators that we found, which was the pursuit of science and international collaboration in hostile environments. So we took those two themes and explored them further in a committee that involves all stakeholders. So not just the states, who are the primary agents in international law and in treaties, but we wanted to give them an advisory committee from people and agencies that were directly impacted by lunar activities. And we would give them one vote each in being able to have a say in compliance and governance. So taking everything, all the wonderful principles that we still have, and just taking that a step further in trying to find if there were consequences for non-compliance. So first of all, we're looking at the treaty for an agreement from states, then we're looking for compliance and governance from key stakeholders in lunar activities.
So just to add to that, we understand that the current system that is being devised for any sort of activity on the moon has come from very few actors. And under international law, if there are multiple actors, if we have a multilateral treaty, then it is always better for the normative framework that would come up later on. So we believe that if more countries come on board, and if we do have a multilateral treaty for that, under potentially the United Nations system, then the normative framework that would be established would be more holistic and take the views of all the nations, most of the nations into account, and it would be acceptable to most, such as the Outer Space Treaty. So that is the reason why we are pushing for a multilateral system which will govern activities on the moon.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other question? We have a couple from online participants.
Oh, thank you. Mainly a word of congratulations to both TP groups. The quality of your analysis, research and presentation was, in my opinion, wonderful, and it gives me great hope as someone nearing the end of my career that the future of international space activity is in good hands, and the International Space University is the best vehicle for finding the brightest talent internationally, and training them, educating them, and sending them out to do important things for our future. So congratulations. I don't know whether that's a signal to me to stop talking, but just one question, comment. Did you give any thought to the question of how human settlements in space should be governed in the future? The current treaties did not address that question because they were formulated so long ago, but we are now seriously thinking about human settlements in space. Should we use the colonial model that characterises human settlements on Earth, or should we already be thinking about self-governing models?
So the frame, okay.
Thank you for that great question, Michael. That's one of the reasons that we came up with the committee overseeing lunar activities, is that it's basically a committee that has a living document, and that is that it can be updated as needs arise. We actually did put some thought into lunar habitation and those that will be born on the moon. And what we came up with is basically the COLA model can be added onto as needs arise. So you can have further stakeholders, hopefully uneven, if it could be negotiated that way, so that when a majority vote is cast as an advisory component for the treaty updates, that there would be that majority vote there. So in answer to the second part of your question, I'll pass that to Adi.
Yes, thank you for the great question. First of all, we have looked at multiple models that are already there. The only one which would be relevant to us here is the model of the International Space Station, where each module has its own governance mechanism of the country. So in the beginning, we presuppose that nations would apply their own laws, the colonial model that you were referring to. But in case of any internal governance that has to be there, for example, in any entity inside, then they could come up with their own rules and regulations. For example, in this auditorium, we need to be silent. So these rules and regulations can be evolved in those bodies as and when the need arises. But the overall arcing law, at least in the beginning, would be, of course, the laws of the nation states to which those parties belong. Yeah.
There is a...
Hi, to follow up, happy birthday, Michael. Okay, I had exactly that same questions that I had put also in my feedback to the full report, which I assessed. Essentially, my overall impression is that, first of all, congratulations, you've done a great job researching and analyzing and summarizing the existing thinking and the existing knowledge. What I would have liked to see, and I know and acknowledge that there is very little time, so you probably run out of time as well. But if you can today just freeball it a little bit from the constraints of what you've actually read, what would you come up with if you were given free rein in thinking, okay, once we go to the moon and we start establishing human avant-posts in space, not only on the moon, but possibly beyond, how would we want a human society to organize itself? Why do we still need that these humans would need to respond to authorities on Earth from the legal perspective? And from a more scientific perspective, is there any thinking as to what we might want to research in order to overcome the technological difficulties? Because all that I see with the technological recommendations are technology that already exists. But what about giving some thought into promoting and furthering big projects that might actually solve scientific issues that might then be used as solutions for human permanence in space? So feel free, elaborate a little bit, give me something more in addition to what you've already done brilliantly, but that could actually, show a new generation of thinkers into going into space rather than we all these that have already come up with, whatever we have come up with. Do you have something bold that you might like to share with us today?
Thank you for the twofold question. Not easy, but the first part is the society organization, and then the technical part.
Yes, thank you for the great question. If we are not constrained at all by anything that we have right now, so we also saw some documents coming in from some universities in the United States where they drafted the constitution for Mars. So if we could ideally have a possible constitution for lunar governance, that is a possibility that can be looked into. A lot of the things that we can put over there, human rights for that matter, and all those things can be put into that constitution, and it would specifically deal with the issues that could potentially arise on the moon. So that's one possible outcome of this discussion that we are at. Thank you.
From a technical point of view?
I think that's a really, really good question. We thought about what's the future technology that can benefit the humankind beyond what we have investigated in this report. So one important fact that we have thought about is that all the technologies that's based on Earth are relatively mature, but unfortunately, we haven't got much validations or testings that under the microgravity or vacuum, all these conditions that are unique on the moon, things will have to be tested and validated there. So that's the first step to go. And of course, that'll be accompanied by fast and slow breakthroughs that will benefit Earth, which we can't really predict now, will have to be happen once we have that capability to be doing things on the moon. But to take advantage of the unique lunar conditions, for example, the temperature changes, the microgravity and vacuum, this will benefit a lot of other manufacturing methodologies or methods that we cannot do on Earth. For example, I think the optics that we can't really produce well on Earth, but if we brought them down to the moon, they can be translucent, they can be long, they can be much better quality on the Earth. And also like additive manufacturing, and a lot of the additive manufacturing facilities needs protection of atmosphere, argon or nitrogen that's required, but on the moon we don't need it. But there will be other challenges that has to be taken into consideration. So manufacturing or some relevant technologies will be very different from the Earth, and all those information I think are very important to inspire what we have on Earth, but more importantly for the further space exploration.
If I can follow up from that, then keep imagining. How would you compose a human avant-post? What kind of qualifications then? If you have to achieve all of these things for the future that are new, then you cannot bring from Earth in terms even of ideas. What would be your ideal lunar society made like? What would it look like? Who would you need up there? Because at the moment, it seems like what's being promoted is a model of free-for-all, whoever can launch a rocket is going to go to the moon, do whatever. That seems to be Artemis pretty much. But if we have some really lofty goals into advancing human societies, as well as the science that we would like to do that we cannot do on Earth, then you need to have some kind of profile of the humans that are going to be living on the moon for a start. Is there any thinking that has gone within the team as to how you would select the humans that go and live on the moon?
So we haven't within of course within the project scope we didn't think that too much, but we have gone through some discussions currently about this. So in order because we're talking about sustainability for all humankind, so then of course, initially the scientists in each field, if we could gather them, so those will be the important people to get onto the moon to study the testing and validation of the on Earth technologies that get inspiration from that as well. And of course, there will be engineers and technicians that can do things and hands-on with the hands-on experiences. Because I think that the scope we covered in the current project, because the two most urgent problems to solve on the moon are power and surface mobility. So things related to these two will have to be selected first because they are the most urgent ones. And then the accompanying supports and people and facilities have to be the first tier people or facilities get brought onto the moon.
Yeah, obviously the ideal end state is a settlement anyone can live in, much like cities we have on Earth. Everyone has their role. It's not necessarily related to the upkeep of the settlement structures or infrastructure itself. But initially, of course, we'll have to send specialists, much like any NASA mission, any group of astronauts. There will need to be engineers, people who pilot things down to the surface, people who oversee manufacturing, setting things up, connecting. Ricardo talked about smart grids. Connecting everything up to the grid would have to be a specialist job, but the ideal end state, of course, is a settlement anyone can live in.
Good morning. I would just like to add to what my colleagues just said. Australia is actually world leading in some of the technologies that are quite applicable to going to the moon. So for example, remote operations, which we're currently using in the mining sector. They are quite easily transferable into the space industry. So I believe that we're actually quite well prepared to tackle that for the start. Yeah.
Just quickly, we did imagine that. We had a vision for 2050, and we had discussions on, would it be humans at that extent actually on the moon? Would it be a composite of artificial intelligence and robotics? And should they have stakeholder engagement equally with corporations, NGOs, academia, and states? And so that's why we thought the model of the committee overseeing lunar activities that is transient and can expand was a good model to be able to include what may come in 2050 if we're going to have robots and composites of humanity with robotics as well. Is that a hybrid human? Do they have the same rights? And so that's why we wanted to involve a model where that could all be debated, and also have, in terms of humanity on the moon, dispute resolution and a set of legal frameworks in which to work out consequences. So damages, punitive, also building on the UN's work in terms of sanctions and boycotts. And we really drilled down and actually made quite a few definitions of what that would be and what that would look like, so that we could metaphorically give that to the COLA committee to then start working out a code of conduct. So that code of conduct is something that is a living document and evolves with increasing stakeholders as well.
I think that was covering. I mean, legal, from a legal point of view, at least, it's bold enough. Yeah, we have Francois now on the Zoom call.
Yes, hello, thanks a lot. It was a pleasure listening to all of you. I have seen many of the points I had the chance to discuss with many of you when I was in Adelaide some time ago. So congratulations to the whole team. Good work, a lot of work, so really thumbs up. I particularly liked three aspects of your presentation, the political and legal framework that you have explained quite substantially, the engineering constraints and design aspects, and of course the whole point about the resources, which of course is essential if we are serious about long-term sustainable settlement on the moon. I have seen less input on two aspects of long-term human settlement on the moon. The first one is the issue of the reduced gravity with respect to the Earth gravity. We all know that the lunar gravity is 1/6 the Earth gravity. And I would like to hear from you, how do you see the impact of this reduced gravity on daily life in a human settlement? So that's the first question. And the second question is on the financial aspects. Have you given some thought on the business model for a long-term human settlement on the moon? What would be the financial flow, value created, etc., etc.? Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Francois, for the two questions. So the first one about the gravity, just maybe a note that we developed a kind of a resource and environmental effect table in our report. And gravity, for example, for transportation was considered as a facilitator, because it helps in reduce the load on structures, facilitating the long distance transport of heavier loads, and that helps with the robotics and so on. And I think it impacts the habitat, and so I will pass it to Hayden.
So yeah, with regards to reduced gravity, we see its impacts pretty much everywhere. As Raf mentioned, there are differing structural requirements on the moon than we have on Earth. We looked into underground habitats, besides lava tubes, even just modules that could bury themselves in the regolith to insulate themselves. But obviously such excavation would be impacted by the lower gravity because there's less pulling you down, so you're less capable of actually digging on the moon. Besides that, transportation is another area that's impacted most strongly, even just for regular humans. We've seen footage. The Apollo astronauts moved around primarily by bouncing because it was just more effective than walking at that stage. And this ties in with rovers as well, and rockets launching and landing. They kick up a lot of regolith, so there's that to consider. Whenever you take a rover between, say, two different parts of a settlement, you're going to be kicking up a lot of lunar dust that's going to get caught in the rover itself, in the equipment surrounding you. So yeah, that's, we see the impact of lower gravity almost everywhere, and it is going to be a pretty big challenge to overcome, but we didn't cover it in the report primarily, again, because of scope. There's only so much we can fit into 42 pages.
Just one more thing, concerning the financial part, as we saw the programs that we're talking about, Artemis and ILOS, it's mostly like governmental actions being carried out. And that's when, for the financial part, the sustainable part in the financial point of view, that's where the commercial actors come in. For example, currently we have Artemis, which is pretty much opening the door for the access to the moon. And then you have companies that are like Blue Origin, which are already collaborating. They come in and they have their own sustainable financial model that come in on top of it. So in a way, like the big programs are opening the doors, and the commercial sectors are the one making it sustainable for financial reasons. And there's also a point about, that's where things that we covered earlier, like space tourism, and those are going to be a new economies that are going to be created. And those are the ones that need to be commercially sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, you won't have any commercial actors. So those are the ones where they have their own timeline or their own way of doing things, and that's where the commercial sector is the best at, to make things financially sustainable. Yeah.
Also, we are going to see a rise in development for vibration mitigation, because one sector of the gravity, it's going to be very hard for the vibration machines, because everything that we do in manufacturing that it's not additive manufacturing, it's with cut-off metal, so less weight, the same mass but less weight is going to be very harmful for machines. So we are going to go to a rise of vibration mitigation and analysis in the engineering point of view, and we are going to have also a good advantage in how to construct things there, because they are going to weigh less, so you are going to be able, in the short term, to rise up more heavy things there. So it's going to be a very interesting time to see how the engineering is going to develop there.
Just one point to add is that on the International Space Station, ESA and NASA have been testing materials on polymers, additive manufacturing, or just subtractive manufacturing, and they have validated that it doesn't show much variations between the properties you get from things made on the International Space Station with Earth, but that doesn't mean many other things will be the same. And they're now they've been testing the metal production and metal additive manufacturing aspects, and it'll be interesting to see how their outcomes are on that aspect.
And if I may just tie together the low gravity and financial aspects, the lower gravity on the moon does mean that launches are going to kick up more stuff, but it also means you don't need as much of a rocket to get to orbit. You don't need to pay for as much fuel. Launch costs from the moon are going to be cheaper. So there's that to keep in mind with regards to financial sustainability as well.
I hope we cover it all. Maybe what we didn't cover, maybe further studies, the physiological impact on the human body of a low gravity body. That is something that we consider, of course. Another one from the Zoom call? Or, no, somebody from the audience? Online. Filomena, yes, please.
Thank you. I really liked the word that a previous assessor mentioned about comprehensive. I was very impressed with how comprehensive your presentation was. When we decided on that one slide where you said, why return? I have a comment and then it's followed by a question. When you asked the question, why return? One thing that I found for me personally that was missing is the whole notion that we should return because it's the moon. It's amazing. It's something we see and take for granted every day to whatever degree. And I found for myself, it's just a comment that I didn't want it to be just, okay, we're going to go colonize, we're going to go take resources. And I thought that I wanted to see something that talked about how amazing the moon is. And this is one of the big reasons why we should go. But that being said, I saw the passion in your presentation when you were going through all of the details and the different aspects of this very comprehensive presentation. So my question is, it might be for Hayden or for someone else. I want to understand the pros and cons with regard to a pressurized versus an unpressurized rover. If you could make a comment on that, anyone on the team, perhaps.
Well,
and this is with regard to the surface mobility.
Yeah. Okay. So, a pressurized rover is essentially a rover that can maintain its own atmosphere. So, unpressurized vehicles are good for short duration trips, but you have to keep in mind that the astronauts have to wear their space suits, their EVA suits, while in them. Those are very clumsy, and you can't stay in them for long. They have limited oxygen supplies. So a pressurized rover essentially just keeps the astronauts more comfortable and more capable within the space, within the cockpit, I guess. And it also increases the possible duration of the trips you can take in that rover. So yeah, it's primarily just for making longer journeys.
So just make the astronauts work longer.
Yeah.
I think this connects also to our hope in the roadmap that at a certain point we will have enough refueling station for battery, oxygen, or atmosphere. So that will make the radius of reachability more than a few dozen kilometers of today's potential rover.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, please, the question from last person online. Yuki. Yes. Yuki, do you have a question?
Sorry. Well, first, I'd like to congratulate you guys. I appreciate very much this. You have done a very good job. So, just want to ask you, since the exploration and colonization of the moon can be benefited and accelerated as the space ecosystem rapidly evolves, which was the subject of the previous TP. My question is, if you guys took this opportunity to interact with the other group to mature, for example, the roadmap that you come up with, because the ecosystem, they talk about startups and innovations and things like that. And when you put your ideas in a roadmap, you are talking about time. What will happen in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Because new ideas will show up, people will die, things will change, and how if you guys exchange ideas, I think it would be a very good opportunity. But if you don't have this chance, and the other thing is that when you have also table 2 that you have put in this report, because we are talking about 30 years time horizon. Yeah, and my question is which phase does the team believe is the most critical for the proposed roadmap not to be delayed? Could eventual risk, budget, technology, insufficient workforce, cultural differences in international cooperation, geopolitics, or other wishes? This is, and I have just another question, is considering the TP's consideration, conclusions and recommendation, as well as reflecting on the importance of long-term international cooperation, and especially when you mentioned in the summary, achieving this presence on the lunar surface will require a collective effort by all humanity. And I would like to understand how the poor countries and with few resources can, in fact, be part of this great endeavor and also capitalize over time. Or is this just a kind of a rhetorical inspiration? I would like to know your opinion about that too. That's it.
Thank you. You gave us also very good points. And I think question 1 and 3 can be kind of connected because the two teams of the two TPs come from the same background, so we had the same inspiration. And I think the idea behind giving these two TPs that are two pieces of the same puzzle was that we could kind of merge into each other. So we do rely on the ecosystem. We talked about that. We didn't want to, of course, steal each other's spotlight, so they had a great cover of the part that you just mentioned in the question 3, that is about aspiring nations and emerging space agencies. So I think we do rely on that, and that may also merge into the question 2. The sooner we start like emission trade-offs, the better. That is affecting costs and any other aspects. So we do think that is critical at the very beginning. Somebody?
Thank you for the question. In answer to which would be more pressing, I don't see any one component more important than the other necessarily. It is pressing with the technological advancements that we're having and the pressing for travelling to the moon and habitation within a few short years to have agreements in place. So there seems to be a lack of consensus, some gaps, perceptions of multilateral or unilateral agreements, and what probably needs to be done is more stakeholder engagement in order to close those gaps and have those agreements done on Earth before we actually get any further into space.
Maybe just to add on to this, I think space is hard. So I believe the key to a successful mission, whether it's going to be Artemis in the end or whether it's going to be ILRS, is collaboration, international collaboration, because we can all learn from each other. And every country has something to offer that contributes to the success. And like we said, space is for everyone. So, yeah.
And I think we are running out of time, so I pass the floor. Thank you, guys.
So, wow, thank you. That was equally thought-provoking. Very, very good, insightful things. Again, thank you to both TP projects. Both of them were home runs. I love the aspects here, especially at the end, where we found a way to talk about tying them together, because I think that was thoughtful on our part. So we're glad, because that does tie you together as you go forward, right? So very, very good. Again, we're on a tight schedule. We've got some other things that the participants have to do. Basically, I want to thank all the assessors. We're going to head up to the room here in a second and do the same thing we did earlier. Thank you for our guests. We really appreciate your time. For those of you that are online as well, we appreciate your time. So I think the participants are staying here. And so everybody else needs to leave because they have a private session. And I do believe there's probably a little bit of some services still outside, some tea and some coffee and stuff. And so I thank you for your time. And don't forget that we have closing ceremonies that promptly start sharply at 4 p.m. and we'd like to see everybody there. So thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you, guys.